You have failed again, I see. Sorrow, anger, regret, guilt. Nothing but empty words to you. Fill your hollow heart with rage. Let it engulf you, consume you, that you may burn your world to the ground. Is what you're feeling even real? It's time you stopped pretending. All those lives cut short at your hand. There's still so much to be done. Were the planet to die, so many things would be lost, and I would be loath to live in such a world. The reunion is nothing to fear. Cloud, allow me to redeem myself. Lend me your strength. Let us defy destiny together.
In a trilogy defined by a level of mystery that has not been witnessed before, one specific problem sits at the heart of almost every attempt to figure out where the story is going: the Sephiroth Dilemma. No matter what camp you belong to, it all starts and inevitably ends with this. Why are there different versions of him, and what is his ultimate goal? A big question mark not only for those who have come to believe in his upcoming redemption, but even those who argue against it. No matter where we stand, we seemingly can't make sense of his actions and how paradoxical they are to what he says. Some perspectives have used this Sephiroth duality as the main driver behind the premise that this is a story that has become aware of how it ends, and has given itself the possibility to end differently. And if you already know this channel, this might come as a surprise, but yes, I agree that Sephiroth's motivations are probably the biggest hint that something's off. The problem, however, is not whether something's off, rather, what is it that is off, and where is it leading to? Is this existence of multiple Sephiroth motivations within the story leading to a remake of the ending, or a simpler recontextualization? And by the way, if this word was a bit more marketable, it would have been one of my favorite picks for the long-awaited Part 3 title. But don't worry, I do have one for you, and you'll know it when you hear it. The Sephiroth Dilemma is actually more relevant to what is supposed to come after this trilogy, the Final Fantasy VII movie sequel, Advent Children, rather than the remake itself. And the question we're about to ask is something that we could have asked right when we watched the movie for the first time. How the hell does Sephiroth even come back after he is defeated in Final Fantasy VII? In fact, what is the mechanism by which he keeps coming back? And why does he seem even more obsessed with Cloud once he does? The inevitable dilemma that the remake trilogy has brought us to face is the following. If the story is still leading to the same place with Sephiroth's defeat, then how does Advent Children, where Sephiroth appears once again, follow the same continuity? Not only that, but Remake has an additional mandatory question to answer of its own. If Sephiroth's fate is exactly the same as before, why is the story portraying him as someone who is aware of what will happen? And why go the extra mile and release a prequel that shows him in a clear moment of reflection, directly tying into the remake plot? Sephiroth standing at the edge of creation. The challenge with the dilemma isn't the lack of possible outcomes. There are two of them to be precise. At the end of this story, Sephiroth will either be defeated for good, or he won't. But as it stands, neither satisfies all necessary conditions. In true Final Fantasy VII fashion, we're presented with two choices, but neither looks like the right one. Helping heal Cloud or stopping Biggs. Protecting Glenn or Rosen. Saving Aerith or letting her go. A universe with Genova's figure looming in the background, or an alternate path hinging on us trusting Sephiroth. Do you see the trend here? These conundrums are scattered everywhere in the story, and there always seems to be an additional wildcard choice coming out of nowhere, just like the vendors in Cloud and Aerith's date in Sector 5, making us realize that our initial decision did not matter as much as we thought. because we were not shown all the options, and especially not the one which the vendor or the story wanted to put forward. For one of these Sephiroth Dilemma choices to be the right one, it will have to achieve the seemingly impossible task of answering these questions in a satisfying way. If he is defeated again but returns 2 years later in Advent Children, what was the point in portraying him differently and giving him this dichotomy, implying a change in his arc? And if he does not return in Advent Children, then it's a classic time travel paradox. How does he become aware of his own subsequent defeat in the movie sequel, allowing him to go back in time and summon memories from that same movie which should not exist anymore now that he has been defeated? This is not even talking about the thematic implications of bringing such a mechanic to Final Fantasy VII. So what I want to show you today is a possible third choice which we might not have been presented with before, and which could satisfy both conditions, setting up Sephiroth's return in Advent Children while making sense of why there are two Sephiroths to begin with. And where we're starting is exactly that, the many Sephiroths acting against one another, a key addition to the new remake story. Or is it? The only way we can understand Sephiroth's true intentions, what each version of him means and where his arc is going, is simply by looking at everything the story throws at us, his past, words, actions, and more importantly, his evolving characterization. So, I'm sorry to say this, but you will have to bear with me as we dive into his past and buy into what Square Enix told us in 2023 when releasing the FF7 prequel featuring his backstory, the claim that we still did not know Sephiroth. Now, Final Fantasy VII at the time of making this video is a 29-year-old story with many entries that have helped expand the lore around the universe and portray characters in more detail. And Sephiroth is no different. Despite his aura, he was originally portrayed as an almost typical, terrifying villain, as we had limited knowledge about him. Advent Children doubled down on that. It made it seem that Sephiroth had even less humanity than before, and that he was now particularly obsessed with Cloud, a small departure from the real Sephiroth in the original game. Crisis Core added a bit more nuance. It showed us his bonds with Angeal and Genesis, and gave us a much better portrayal of the Nibelheim events. When he lost his mind, he was still in control though, and closer to what we remembered him as in the original game. Crisis Core portrayed the picture of a special soldier who tragically becomes a villain, but still a heartless one at that. So it is no surprise that when Remake released, there was some backlash over how much we're seeing him compared to the original story that made him the Sephiroth in our minds. While I empathize with this view, I think that the expanded lore in Remake, and especially the first soldier, did a great job in giving us more context about him without necessarily taking out the madness. I understand that people simply wanted him to be as terrifying as in the original game. He did not even appear in the Midgar segment and was hailed as this ultra-powerful soldier who somehow found a way to be back from the dead. And there is the Nibelheim incident flashback, where his portrayal is much darker and mysterious in the original game. So I wouldn't have had any issues with them sticking to the same way of doing it, and I think it's valid points raised by the players, but I also empathize with the very sensitive task that the developers had while writing his character for Remake. From the get-go, they set out to portray characters in more detail, and it clearly shows on everyone we play as or interact with. So treating Sephiroth differently could have brought a bit of a disconnect here. They had to at least consider improving his character. And of course, there was no chance that Sephiroth was only going to appear in Part 2. The problem with giving more layers to a villain is that it's an extremely fine line to thread, because you don't want to make them too relatable and take away from their mystique, but you don't want to keep portraying them over and over again the same way as a soulless monster, for example. Yoshinori Kitase himself spoke about this a couple of years ago. When answering why Sephiroth appears much earlier in Remake, he said the following: "There are two main reasons. Firstly, the way we handled Sephiroth in the original Final Fantasy VII was to hide him, hold him back. We wanted to build him up as this really big, powerful character in people's minds. By only referring to him indirectly, it created this feeling of fear and oppression. so when he makes his first appearance, it's a big deal. But for the remake, that doesn't work so well, partly because everybody knows who Sephiroth is. We didn't think it would be as effective to have him held back until later on in the story. Secondly, Sephiroth is this massively overarching presence that looms over the whole Final Fantasy VII saga. We wanted to make sure that aspect of him was present in this first game in the project. That's why we have introduced him much earlier in the story now. Kitas's words also stand out here and directly relate to the fact that narratively, Remake has two almost distinct layers. The first one is the main story, which is simply the retelling of Final Fantasy VII as is, and the second one is what I would call the player's story, which is a meta conversation that the devs are having with those of us who have played the original game. This combination creeps in a lot of scenes, and is especially prominent in big moments that we as players have expectations about. The biggest example to date being the Forgotten Capital. There is an awareness on the game's part that we want to see how this play out, and this message is disguised within the story that the characters themselves are experiencing. The characters don't know that we exist, well, at least for now, but the writers do, and they are making us a part of it. And this is how I understand Kitas's quotes about Sephiroth being a very well-known figure at this point. The game knows that we know that Sephiroth should be terrifying, so it speaks to that and offers something additional. Now, we're talking about the intention here, not whether everyone liked it. I don't think there would have been any major risks again if they simply stuck with a similar portrayal to the original. But that can be said about the whole project. If this remake taught us anything, it is that these writers don't think about how risky a change is, but rather whether it adds something to the Final Fantasy VII story and how we experience it a couple of decades later. And that's why we all knew that it was no coincidence that the Sephiroth prequel was released 6 months before Rebirth. This was clearly intentional, and the devs wanted us to get this information about Sephiroth's past. In fact, the connection is so relevant that among the new FF7 related releases since 2020, one of the major additions to the remake, Loyal Little Stamp, was only referenced in the first Soldier. That's right, Crisis Core Reunion was released in December 2022, and despite being confirmed as relevant to both FF7 OG and Remake by the devs themselves, it still did not feature a single stamp reference, at least not that we know of so far. We can brush that aside with the fact that it was more of a remaster of the 2007 version, but suspiciously, many of the posters that we see in FF7 Remake were purposefully added to Midgar in Crisis Core, except the biggest and most important one story-wise. And mind you, it is not a matter of the stamp propaganda being created after Crisis Core in story either, because it's confirmed that it was created during the war, and because we see it in a game that takes place 15 years before. Anyway, this stamp distinction between the first Soldier and Crisis Core Reunion might actually be a hint on the nature of these entries and how they relate to each other, but that's a topic for another day. The first Soldier starts out as Glenn's story initially, before Sephiroth takes control, and there were no questions from the moment he popped up on screen that this was a radically different Sephiroth to the one we knew. Usually FF7 is pretty good at putting something right in your face when it wants you to pay attention to it. We all remember that Terrier stamp poster again at the end of Remake indicating a parallel world. And this was no different, because this white feather was literally in our faces from the very start of Sephiroth's story. So no bonus points to us for guessing what this whole game was going to be about. The first Soldier had a very clear agenda. There is way more to Sephiroth's character than what we knew, and some might argue that it went too far to portray something we've never seen in him before: humanity. On a side note, this will be a Sephiroth-focused summary, so we won't really introduce the world and characters in that game, but if you want to go through the whole thing, I recommend checking out these two channels which regularly cover Ever Crisis content. In his early days, Sephiroth is basically a human grown in a lab with the sole purpose of turning into the perfect weapon for Shinra, which he does. But the complexity is that he actually demonstrates an incredible amount of self-awareness. we already see him sensing the differences between him and the soldier colleagues he's dispatched with to Rador, Glenn, Matt, and Lucia. He outright tells them that he is a part of the new soldier project, those whose body has been modified to become stronger, but also that he wasn't a hero like they thought, as his achievements were manufactured. Sephiroth is the most special soldier that Shinra has created because he was injected with Genova cells when he was still in the womb, hence giving him the strength that he displays. But sadly, this isn't the only consequence of that, because Sephiroth being injected in the womb also means that he was literally part human, part Genova, something that Hojo has not been able to replicate with the same results, with the only semi-successful experiment being Cloud, but much later in the story and under very different circumstances. So knowing this about Sephiroth, the most fascinating part of the beginning of his story is that even considering what he was, he still showed a lot of humanity from his very first interactions with the group. He disrespected them a couple of times, but right away apologized, explaining that he didn't really interact with anyone before and saying that he just wanted to live a normal life, while recognizing that it was not possible for him. Glenn initially calls him a cyborg, but seeing how much it affects Sephiroth, he apologizes, and the group do their best to welcome him with open arms and show him what human relationships mean. Glenn keeps insisting that Sephiroth can become the hero that Shinra is selling him as, and all of that has a great positive effect on Sephiroth during his time with the Three. But before connecting with this group, the only remotely human connection on Sephiroth's mind was his mother. Hojo had given him this picture and told him that it was his mother and that her name was Genova. But we know that that's a half-truth, of course. While this is indeed his mother, her name is Lucrezia and not Genova. This was literally a plan by Hojo to test his reunion theory, and it worked because Sephiroth showed a great deal of attachment to this picture and a desire to learn more about who he thought was his mother. Right at the end of their mission on the island, the group set out to save Rosen, who Glenn, Matt, and Lucia had become friends with a few days before. This was someone from the enemy who had welcomed them with open arms and was dedicated to his role as the Eye of Rador, alerting others of incoming threats. The trio were feeling bad because they had literally wiped out everyone else except Rosen, but with the island about to disappear into the ocean, they still wanted to save him. And at that point, they had also been saying a lot of good things about him to Sephiroth, which pushed him to insist on joining them. Something they told him was that Rosen and him were the same age, and that prompted him to seek another human connection, seeing how fulfilling the previous one was. The problem was that Rosen wasn't going to leave because he did not want to abandon his mission. Despite hearing that they've killed everyone else on the island, Rosen trusted the trio so much that he did not believe them at first. And it all came down to Sephiroth's attempt to convince him, which somehow ended up with Sephiroth killing him. But before we talk about the meaning of his actions here, Sephiroth had actually lost the necklace with his mother's picture and wasn't able to find it until now, a very important detail. He kills Rosen and this big purple monster appears from the livestream, with Matt wondering, is this the will of the planet? A purple Genova-coded monster appears after a mentally weak protagonist has a big choice to make, feeding off the negative emotions of the moment. Where have we seen that before? The moment this monster is defeated, Sephiroth's necklace with his mother's picture magically reappears. This is the first time of many where the story makes a connection between Sephiroth's emotions and Genova's ability to appear. At face value, it almost seemed as though he earned a reward for making the choice to kill Rosen by getting his necklace back. Glenn is furious and kicks the necklace away. Sephiroth's despair is very visible, initially unable to come to terms with what he did. He brings back Rosen's dog, Stamp. Well, not Stamp, but Glenn jokingly calls him Stamp. And he has a 1-star collar. Not suspicious at all. His real name's Rifu, and he goes back to Midgar with the group. Things happen in between, but the short story is that the three, along with Rifu, leave Sephiroth behind, which is half surprising because they were about to be judged, while Sephiroth was going to be earmarked as the hero who saved the day in Rador. Sephiroth doesn't actually like that and wants to defend them, but inevitably ends up being miserable when he sees that the three left him behind. And despite all of this, 10 years later, we are shown again a Sephiroth who has grown a bit more empathetic, reuniting with Glenn, who apologizes about the necklace. Sephiroth had been sent to Mount Tamblin to look for the soldiers who deserted, which included Genesis and Angeal, but Glenn tells Sephiroth to evacuate everyone because Shinra was about to strike the whole place down. So this was the perfect setup from the story for Sephiroth's most human moment yet. His encounter with Glenn, despite the previous disappointment, triggered something in him and gave him the resolve to try to save everyone and to break the cycle of hate using compassion, by his own words. We see a genuine attempt from Sephiroth to care for human lives, and he succeeds in saving everyone despite reaching his physical limits for once, which leads to this big rewarding moment: Sephiroth getting the plaudits from everyone, being shown love and appreciation for what he just accomplished, including the guy he thought had left him behind 10 years earlier. He finally looked free from Jenova's mind torture, or at least that's what we thought, because this exact moment is when his memory is taken back to the biggest choice he made in his first mission: saving Rosen or the others. Sephiroth literally has one of these static glitches, which we have largely come to associate with Cloud's personality and memory splits. And the reason we quickly went over the Rosen sequence initially, stating that Sephiroth just killed him, is because that's what it looked like from the outside. But in truth, it was an impossible choice for him to make. Saving the guy he met a few seconds ago, or the 3 friends he had bonded with. And he actually shows a lot of compassion towards Rosen and tells him that despite being enemies, they can find a place in their world for him, just like the 3 did for Sephiroth himself. But Rosen outright refuses and pushes Sephiroth to choose. Now, a defiant Rosen literally taunting Sephiroth to kill him certainly didn't help. But in reality, this was almost a fake choice, because you could argue that Sephiroth did not really have to kill Rosen in order to save the other 3. The worst that was gonna happen was that Glenn, Matt, and Lucia weren't going to leave until Rosen accepted, which was not necessarily confirmation that they were ready to die then and there if that didn't happen, and that explains their reaction to seeing Sephiroth kill him. But from his point of view, it was a choice of him versus them. That's when he cast his humanity aside and did what he was created to do: kill the enemy. The Jenova instinct inside of him celebrates this by giving him back his necklace, but also safeguards this specific moment to remind 10 years older Sephiroth of his true nature. It establishes the premise that the only choice he has is to tap into his instinct of destruction, because that's what he is: a part human, part alien Shinra weapon. In his most glorious day yet, this moment was used by Jenova to remind him, and frankly, the parallels with the internal Jenova monologues to Cloud throughout Remake and Rebirth just draw themselves. The first weapon that Jenova uses against its hosts is to devoid them of empathy, compassion, and of striving to save people even when it looks impossible, or at the very least, take that choice and twist it in a way which seems righteous but is not in reality. The first part of Sephiroth's story established a lot about him. It started out strong by showing that despite being grown in a lab, he still had humanity in him and was actively seeking connections, be it through the friendships he built, the urge to seek out his mother, or the desire to save the enemy. But it also showed that despite those good intentions, he was never really in control. Glenn, Matt, and Lucia leaving him behind was then cemented as an internal reminder that he will never belong, and that his path, the path of his kind, is different and unique. It showed that even at his most human and pure moments, he will inevitably be reminded of what he is and what should truly matter to him: a Jenova puppet. The second part of Sephiroth's story doubled down on this, but used a completely contrasting character in Angeal to show how far away from a normal human Sephiroth is. The core difference between the two was their upbringing. Angeal had a very strong sense of self because he had a great relationship with his parents. He had memories that he could turn to in his moments of weakness. And the irony is that, in his mind, Sephiroth also had what he thought was a mother appearing in his dreams and promising to always be by his side after he saw himself left behind by others, which in turn conditioned him to feel the same towards her. A sense of responsibility and the need to cherish and protect her, but at the expense of his relationship with others. Both Angeal and Sephiroth actually had these dreams triggered by Jenova corrupted spirits in their mission together with the purpose of feeding guilt, but they reacted in completely different ways. Angeal was able to recognize real from fake memories and to snap out of it, retaining control over his emotions and keeping his guard up. Sephiroth, on the other hand, kept feeding back into that isolation with his mother and started believing that this was just who he was. The most striking aspect of his past is once again him recognizing how his upbringing conditioned how he thinks and acts, but what this latter part of the story showed was that he was now growing to accept and embrace it. A few months after what happened in Rador, Sephiroth and Angeal are dispatched to the ruins of Robio, south of Wutai, to find and rescue 4 missing soldiers. 3 are dead, but 1 survived. Her name is Alyssa, and Sephiroth is shell-shocked when he discovers that she literally has the face of his mother, the one he's been having dreams of. What started as a rescue mission turned into Sephiroth seeking out the Masamune sword, which specifically caught his eye after an encounter with the person who created it, Masamune himself, under the command of Jenova corrupted spirits in Robio. This results in a series of crazy illusions that the whole party goes through, where they all recognize what's happening but react differently. And we see literal Jenova corrupted spirits, giving the photographer that was tagging along knowledge about the history of this area which he has no business knowing. These illusions test their mental strength, especially Sephiroth, but have no impact on his resolve to pursue the sword. He is already cold to everyone since the start of the mission, especially Angeal, who senses the weakness inside and tries to get through to him, but Sephiroth only grows more distant and starts living in his own illusory world the more the story goes. They have a lot of conversations about how they view the world and how careful they should be in the middle of all these illusions and trials, but Sephiroth grows tired of it and outright tells Angeal that they were raised in different worlds and that they would never see eye to eye. Which is very intentional dialogue, because in this cutscene in FF7 Rebirth, as a part of convincing him to join forces in defying destiny, a half-disappointed Sephiroth tells Cloud that they still see the world differently. In a moment summarizing all of this, Angeal snaps out of one of his fake dream memories, wondering what Sephiroth must be going through inside his own head, and whether he's trapped in a nightmare like he himself was. He understands that nothing that he says will reach Sephiroth, just like Sephiroth himself tells Tifa. The contrast between Sephiroth and Angeal grows bigger as they get closer to getting the Masamune, but unfortunately for Sephiroth, he is unable to snap out of it, and the encouragement that he gets from the woman they literally just met and who has the face of his mother certainly does not help. Sephiroth's past is also weaponized by the spirits, which show him and the others illusions of Glenn calling out to him, prompting him to remember how he was left behind. Angeal points out that the spirits are able to latch on dark repressed emotions, but it's still not getting through to Sephiroth despite understanding what is happening when talking to himself. He ends up succeeding in getting the sword, and the spirits, Alyssa and Bachman, the photographer, all do an incredible job of celebrating his achievement and calling him a hero, despite the obvious fact that he was playing into what the Jenova corrupted spirits wanted him to do in the first place. But at the heart of this journey, Sephiroth's biggest trial was the choices he was forced to make. A Jenova illusion pops up from the void, with Hojo, the orchestrator of Sephiroth's tragic upbringing, making him choose between saving Matt and Lucia. Sephiroth recognizes that it's an illusion, that his choices don't matter, but is pressed by Hojo to demonstrate good judgment, decisiveness, and to set aside the weakness of indecision. He is forced to make another choice later between Rosen and Glenn, and when asking again why he is even forced to choose, he simply gets the answer that his choices don't matter, and that this is his destiny. In his final choice, the illusion takes Angeal and Alyssa prisoners, but because of his mental strength, Angeal is able to break free, resulting once again in no consequence behind Sephiroth's choice. These three instances show how Jenova keeps appearing by feeding off Sephiroth's past, emotions, and weak sense of self, but they also depict how Sephiroth, despite being well aware of what's happening, is unable to do anything about it and keeps giving in. A demonstration of a character's inability to fight against their own tragic quote-unquote destiny, orchestrated by big purple Jenova-controlled entities trying to convince the mentally weak Link in a group that they should accept their fate and give in to the righteous anger and rage inside of them. Where have we seen that before? And mind you, these parallels don't only draw themselves to Cloud's journey, but to older Sephiroth himself. Right before finding Jenova and losing his mind in Nibelheim, Sephiroth looks out from the window in the hotel and says,
"This landscape, I could swear I've seen it before."
a replica of what he says while pursuing the Masamune in Robio. The spirits used what looked like a genuine memory of a picture that his friends showed him and changed the scenery to match it in order to once more remind him of how he was left behind. And honestly, the level of manipulation in the process is quite insane, because we're not only seeing everything change depending on the state of mind of the main character, but at the end of the story, it is revealed that while Sephiroth was seeing the face of his mother in Alyssa, the camera footage captured a completely different person. Jenova had disguised itself to fool him in his quest for the sword. The trials that Sephiroth goes through reinforce in his mind more than ever that the only thing he can do is what the Jenova instinct inside of him and inside the Masamune tells him to do. It strips him of his ability to choose, to affect the world outside of him by making a choice and changing himself, a stark contrast to Angeal's strong convictions of hanging on to one's hopes and dreams. At one point, he even claims that by changing oneself, we can change the world around us. The philosophy that Jenova has conditioned Sephiroth to accept throughout the years is that choices don't matter. The future is already decided under the label of destiny, which is possibly the biggest theme of the story we really want to talk about, Final Fantasy VII Remake. But before we get to that, Sephiroth's past up to what we know today, and from other entries like Crisis Core, paints an increasingly perfect Jenova puppet, which I don't think is a surprise at all, right? We have been able to see more layers to that manipulation, but we already knew some of this, which is why I would argue that despite all the hopelessness that Sephiroth demonstrated while being led by the nose and reminded of his own pain and guilt to remain trapped in a world he constructed for himself, the real addition from his backstory is that despite not having any remotely healthy upbringing at all, Sephiroth did have humanity at one point, and dare I say, almost in a naive way when you see his early interactions with Glenn, Matt, and Lucia. We always thought of Sephiroth as a tragic villain who couldn't have become anything else from the get-go, but the first soldier taught us that he had chances to break free from that path, and that at moments, even a couple of years before losing his mind, he was still looking for human connection, for compassion, and breaking the cycle of hate. So in a way, what his story really brought to the table is that there were two distinct currents inside of him, the Sephiroth who was seeking human connection and the one who was progressively, helplessly led by Jenova. The strength of each one of the currents inside of him was completely unbalanced, of course, which is why he was never able to break free from Jenova's control, but the two sides were still there. He is, after all, biologically part human and part Jenova/alien. And many years and trips inside the live stream later, this distinction makes us wonder if there are indeed two Sephiroths at play in the remake trilogy, a human Sephiroth and a Jenova Sephiroth, representing the dichotomy we saw in his backstory. Vision Sephiroth versus Sephiroth. Or because we have grown obsessed with his pronouns, Ore Sephiroth versus Watashi Sephiroth. This quote-unquote new distinction is at the heart of the Final Fantasy VII Re-trilogy narrative, with this new Sephiroth introduced at the edge of creation, whose nature, according to the remake Ultimania, cannot be guessed even by those who have played the original game, right? Here is the FF7 Ultimania Omega, released 20 years ago, and it says the following. The change of his, as in Sephiroth's, first-person pronoun from Ore to Watashi is an unquestionable indicator of his transformation. Having acquired even more knowledge from within the livestream, he's now trying to seize all the planet's life for himself. The image next to this quote is that of Sephiroth at the Temple of the Ancients, revealing his plan to the party, and using the Watashi pronoun, which in this context indicates a bit more distance as opposed to the less formal, more direct, and sometimes more dominant Ore. In Rebirth, Sephiroth appears and, in his typical "I only speak in riddles" style, reveals his plans to the party again, implying that what they've been hearing at the temple about the Black Materia, summoning Meteor, is what he plans on using to finally claim his birthright, but he adds that he will also reunite the worlds, reigning into infinity. So far, so good. It's all consistent. His character is portrayed with the same distance to our party and possibly us, the players, in both scenes from the original game and the remake trilogy. And more importantly, Watashi seems to indicate the Sephiroth who has lost his mind and wants to claim his mother's legacy, right? Here is Sephiroth in Nibelheim after losing his mind using the pronoun Ore. And you would think this is new to the remake, because Ultimania Omega says that he talks about himself differently after his transformation, right? Here is OG Sephiroth in Nibelheim after losing his mind using the pronoun Ore instead of Watashi. In fact, in the Rebirth flashback, despite his madness being fully portrayed, the only time he uses Watashi at all is when quoting Professor Gast's words from his book. Well, great, because maybe it's simple. This just means that every version of Sephiroth after he dies, as in visions of him, uses Watashi, whereas Ore is exclusive to the Sephiroth, his real self, at the edge of creation, possibly having a different motivation behind his plans with this revamped story and genuinely asking for Cloud's help. Here is a vision of Sephiroth in Rebirth addressing Cloud alone and messing with him about Tifa's true identity, using his quote-unquote human pronoun, Ore. Well, maybe he's back in Rebirth, which is why he now uses Ore exclusively going forward, right? Here is Sephiroth in Rebirth, intimately toying with Cloud again, reverting to Watashi and telling him that he knows the truth, or more accurately in Japanese, "Don't let them fool you, I'm the only one who knows the truth about you." Maybe Ore doesn't necessarily draw the line between the two, but at the very least, Edge of Creation Sephiroth, who we have seen in his own backstory, resolved to do something about what he has become to possibly redeem himself, is an actual distinct version. Here is Sephiroth at the edge of creation, fighting Cloud and Aerith, and using the pronoun Watashi, while saying to Cloud, "Rage my weak little puppet." I probably made this way too long, but do you see where this is going by now? I don't know how much conviction is still out there about Ore and Watashi creating a distinction between instances of Sephiroth, and I don't know how clear we think the distinction is, but the evidence from the dialogue and the different appearances of Sephiroth in Rebirth suggests one of two things. It either doesn't matter at all, which is slightly unlikely because it has been referenced in both Ultimanias of the OG and Remake. Or it might have at one point, but does not anymore, which, judging by the transformation that Edge of Creation Sephiroth himself demonstrates between Remake and Rebirth, could be a valid hypothesis. And you know what? Despite this pronoun discourse likely not amounting to much, I still firmly believe that there are two versions of Sephiroth at play. His true self, who clearly asked for Cloud's help at the Edge of Creation, and the avatar that Jenova uses, especially in Remake, which either comes from a recollection, an illusion, or taking the body of one of the Black Robes. The catch is that pronouns and locations alone might not be a strict differentiator between the two versions anymore, and the nuance we need to think about is not whether there are two different Sephiroths, but if there were, what makes them different and how far does it go? Just because we have two versions of him, it wouldn't necessarily mean that one of them has good intentions while the other doesn't. So far, the strongest case we have had about a good Sephiroth relies on the following. 1. His past, which shows a tragic human being who has never been able to break free from Jenova's shackles despite his good intentions, but which sets up a possibly positive resolution to this as he's shown to be reminiscent over his life at the edge of creation. And 2. His dialogue in Remake with Cloud in the same place, which is in a clearly different tone, asking for help in defying destiny and showing a resolve to not erase Cloud or himself. So for a moment, let's give the guy the benefit of the doubt as we wait for the inevitable climax of his arc in Part 3. Here is what the Remake Ultimania Plus says about Sephiroth and Cloud's interaction at the edge of creation. Sephiroth, 7 seconds before the end, but there's still time. Sephiroth shows a meaningful, knowing smile. If he won't fight alongside him, then this leaves him no choice but to keep manipulating him and leading him as before. Sephiroth, the future depends on you, Cloud. When Cloud turns around, Sephiroth is gone and black feathers are fluttering in the air. 30 seconds into giving this guy the benefit of the doubt, and he's already acting sus. Our last hopes of a Sephiroth redemption arc hinge on that last cutscene at the end of Remake, where Sephiroth realizes that he has no choice but to manipulate Cloud further in order to achieve what he thinks is his righteous goal, after reminiscing over his inability to break free from Jenova's shackles. And the environment itself is ominous because visually it makes it seem that Sephiroth wants to break free, with Jenova's shadow looming in this design behind Cloud while pursuing what looks like a more pure dream, as in saving the planet. Except we have this, a comment from the environment artwork team in the Remake material Ultimania. Sephiroth's wing was used as inspiration for the background featured in the final confrontation between Cloud and Sephiroth. Sometimes beautiful things in life don't come from positive places. I don't know about you, but I don't like this. I don't feel comfortable trusting that the only hope we have to save the planet in Remake is this guy, who even when acting like a changed man, still uses deception and a refusal to take no for an answer. A guy who literally goes on to call Cloud his weak little puppet in the very last fight we have in the story so far. So what gives? How can there be two different Sephiroths without one necessarily being good? More importantly, what has Sephiroth achieved at the end of Remake to create this distinction? Do his actions in Rebirth at the edge of creation align with what he claims he wants to do, or has he simply made us fall in the same trick once again after posing for this seemingly pure moment of reminiscence? In order to figure out where the different Sephiroths are going, we need to look at the one major thing that changed between the end of Remake and the beginning of Rebirth after his intervention. From the moment the Whispers, beings who can enforce and shape events, have been introduced, the Remake narrative became a battleground for will, both for the planet collectively and for the main character, Cloud, individually. And all of Sephiroth's actions in the trilogy so far have been about winning this battle, even when it means going against Jenova's will. See, the Whispers are still largely understood as the will of the planet, a notion that is very vague and that a lot of us have come to accept as naturally the planet defending itself, which makes us wonder why actual white Whispers who do act to defend the planet are depicted later in Rebirth, and why they differ from the grey/black tainted Whispers in Remake. The Whispers, which basically represent will itself, are largely misunderstood and confusing because the story wants them to be. The essence of the planet, the lifestream, is essentially made up of memories through the spirits that live and return to it, and technically, as Aerith clarifies, the Whispers we see in Remake are some of these spirits of the dead, roaming and dictating the will of the lifestream and the planet based on their memories, hopes, and dreams. The problem with spirits in the lifestream is that they are also prone to being corrupted by something that cannot return to the planet, Jenova. This mechanism is not only on display in Remake. In the novel that depicts events between OG FF7 and Advent Children, On the Way to a Smile, a specific chapter, Livestream Black, shows Sephiroth's actions in the livestream, leading to him being able to come back once again in the movie. Here goes. When the livestream erupted onto the surface of the planet, the man had already surrendered his inconsequential memories to the planet. At the same time, the core of his spirit and those memories deeply related to it moved from torrent to torrent and traveled around the land from city to city. When the people who were trying to escape or those left unable to do anything but stand still were enveloped by those streams, he decided to leave them with his stigma. If Cloud noticed that stigma, the man was certain that he would never disappear. So the mechanism exists, but does this imply that the will of the planet has been entrusted to Jenova? Well, yes and no, because not all whispers are corrupted. The fact that some spirits have been controlled by Jenova has led to a battle taking place inside the livestream, with an increasing interference from her, and it has been portrayed in Remake quite clearly, to be honest. In short, whispers as spirits roam in the livestream can and are visibly being corrupted by Jenova and or Sephiroth eventually. And mind you, this deception tactic of infiltrating something that should be pure is not new to Jenova. The Cetra themselves tell how she was able to manipulate them by appearing as their dead loved ones. And we don't even need to go 2,000 years in the past to witness how corrupted spirits work, because we have seen how they led Sephiroth and his party by the nose in his quest to get the Masamune, changing the landscape and taking the form of past friends to match the deep memories or desire inside their target and evoke a specific emotion, triggering the action that the spirits themselves are manipulated to enforce. And if we go to Remake, the opening intro paints the picture of a world that is barely hanging on, something that is confirmed through dialogue as we go through the story. That path has probably been caused both by humans draining the planet of its spiritual energy and Jenova lingering in the livestream. The Whispers, who initially seem neutral, are actually already divided into two factions in Remake, but in a much more subtle way. We have the usual Whispers called Mysterious Spectres, and we have this purple variation, the Enigmatic Spectres, which the literal Japanese translation calls Void Demon. Does this sound familiar? The Remake material Ultimania says the following about these Whispers. They try to obstruct the player, and the more a player proceeds into an area, the more of a hindrance they become. Once the player goes beyond a certain stage, an attack whisper appears, acting as a direct hindrance to the player. These are more aggressive forms of whispers who deploy the other defense whispers to hinder the player. The only way to beat the stronger attack whispers, as in these enigmatic specters, is through defeating the other, weaker defense whispers, also known as mysterious specters. And during the only times we fight the whispers at all in Remake, before the expressway of course, 2 to be precise, this purple enigmatic specter appears and takes over the regular ones. See, these quote-unquote neutral whispers can now actually be controlled by a quote-unquote void adjacent monster with a color coding that very clearly implies a Jenova corruption. And mind you, that reference is not so subtle anymore when you fight the alleged embodiment of the will of the planet, the Whisper Harbinger, and its 3 smaller versions, which have been confirmed to be inspired by the fighting style of the Jenova remnants from Advent Children. But as we said, the nuance is that through Remake, the Whispers don't seem to be all bad, because we do see them saving Barrett, which wouldn't really make sense if they were simply enacting Jenova's plan. And this leaves us with one possible explanation, which is that the Whispers we saw in Remake, while enforcing the will of the planet, or rather, what the planet thinks its will should be based on the spirits within it, were made up of both benevolent and potentially malicious, tragically Jenova corrupted factions. It's the planet collectively, gradually being convinced of its inevitable death, with Jenova orchestrating it all in the background. And a big point of contention in the past few years around the Whispers has been how clear-cut it all seemed when Tifa asked whether they symbolized capital D destiny, to which Red 13 answered yes, for it is the will of the planet itself. This sentence has been understood by many of us to be as close of a confirmation as we will ever get that the planet itself is protecting what we think are the events of the original game. However, in the Japanese equivalent of this conversation, it paints a completely different picture. Rather than doubling down on the planet itself enforcing its will, Red 13 says, yes, it seems that the planet is running out of power or energy, something confirmed in the other localizations. And Barrett's challenge to Red 13, wondering if the Whispers would try to enforce even a bleak future, is not so subtle commentary on what's really being implied here. It's surprisingly consistent with the premise that the planet is being convinced of its inevitable death through the livestream. As a matter of fact, when talking about what Red 13 gets as knowledge from coming in contact with Aerith, Toriyama says that Red 13 is special because his kind lives for so long that he can see that knowledge, but also that the amount he received was so vast that he was not able to see everything clearly. And this is very relevant to the Whisper quote-unquote bad ending visions. The nuance here is that 1. We see 500 years into the future, not the past, when Red 13 himself and his species will still be alive, and 2. He doesn't see those visions very clearly. We could think of the visions he gets as something similar to what Cloud gets, flashes of things that don't necessarily make sense on their own, just like Red 13 running in the middle of nowhere, with no indication on where he's going, what the world looks like at that point, and whether this is a positive or negative picture. But as we said before, given that the planet is being convinced of its inevitable death, another key to understanding the will of the planet is the cycle of life and death and how it can be instrumentalized. In fact, just like spirits that live within it, the planet itself having a cycle of life and death is not even a new concept to the Final Fantasy VII compilation. In Dirge of Cerberus, which takes place 3 years after Final Fantasy VII, a party of Vincent and others from the main cast trying to save the planet are shown this vision from Lucrezia's research, which states that the planet itself, in time, returns to the cosmos when her time has come. The statement that the Whispers intervening in Remake were the will of the planet is not entirely incorrect, but it is also only a half-truth in the context of the FF7 crisis. The Whispers are spirits who enforce the will of the planet and preserve it, but they're also progressively corrupted by Jenova, possibly for the past 2,000 years since it crashed on Gaia and went into deep slumber after being defeated by the Cetra. The more of these spirits there are, the more the planet will be convinced or forced to accept its inevitable death. And this conflict shows in the actions of the Whispers, which act in very contradicting ways, sometimes helping the party and sometimes hindering them. But one thing is certain, when we get to the expressway and cross into the singularity, the Whisper Harbinger and the 3 Whispers are all clear manifestations of Jenova's control over the Whispers, trying to enforce the path forward. That is, until Sephiroth decides to change that. See, in theory, all the appearances of Sephiroth up to the expressway section are very easy to understand. Despite having 4 categories, we don't have 4 Sephiroths. 3 of those are simply recollections and or Jenova illusions of Sephiroth, either spontaneously or through one of the black robes, which initially only Cloud can see. And the remake Ultimania agrees, specifying that the question mark Sephiroth is the one whose nature is impossible to guess even by players in the original game. His first appearance is here, when he asks Cloud to cross the barrier of destiny with him. Portions of the script also allude to Aerith sensing that this Sephiroth is different and seemingly taking him much more seriously than the other appearances. But before that, one version of Sephiroth initially kills the president, and the Whispers are fine with it, but they strongly react when he's about to kill Barrett. So, is that actually the first appearance of the Sephiroth? Well, this might never be confirmed, but it's possible, because while not being on the side of the Whispers, he does turn into Jenova eventually, and it's later revealed that this is simply Marco, one of the Black Robes, who was summoned to get Jenova's body out of the Shinra building, something that the Black Robe number 2 will manage to do. And the reason I'm saying that this could be the Sephiroth is precisely because of this connection to the Black Robes. More on that in a minute. Now, Jenova's biggest property, the reason the FF7 plot exists to begin with, is its ability to enact the reunion. Hojo's reunion theory claims that even if Jenova's body is dismembered, it will eventually become one again. And at this point in the story, there are two main known locations of Jenova's remains. Her headless body is in the Shinra building, which is what the robes seemingly try to extract, while her head is at the northern crater with Sephiroth. Which begs the question, why is the reunion happening at the northern crater and not at the Shinra building? Why wouldn't all Jenova's body parts move towards the Shinra building instead, where the biggest part of its body is stored? And the good thing is that we possibly have an answer to this from the OG FF7 Omega Ultimania once again. Sephiroth's will begins to control not only his sibling-like Sephiroth copies, but the body of his mother Jenova as well. From this point on, although Sephiroth's true body is active only in the final battle, his thoughts are expressed through Jenova. For this reason, the text also lists Jenova's actions. Perhaps because Jenova's head is with Sephiroth, or perhaps because Sephiroth's will is so strong, the reunion does not occur at the Shinra building where Jenova is located. Rather, Jenova herself begins to migrate. The first comment is referring to a portion which says that Sephiroth summons his copies to get Jenova from the Shinra building, and the analysis goes on to say that from that point onwards, Sephiroth basically starts expressing his thoughts and desires through Jenova. And in the FF7 Rebirth Ultimania, a similar concept is presented. It is said that Sephiroth has manipulated a man in a black cloak to steal Jenova's body from the Shinra building, and that while the party were sometimes helped or hindered by the Whispers in Midgar, Sephiroth absorbed part of them in the Singularity, allowing him to manifest his will through them. This is why I am more and more skeptical about this quote-unquote new Sephiroth dichotomy, because of this notion of Sephiroth potentially taking over Jenova's will already being an idea in the original story, although it might not have been developed as much, obviously. Technically, all of the above prompts us to think that while the reunion could have initially started in the Shinra building, the Sephiroth was lurking in the background, using the black robes to extract Jenova's body and redirect them towards his location. And in order to have full control over proceedings, he needed to make sure that Jenova's will was broken and that he was at the center to absorb it all. And in the process, the Sephiroth was now reborn, both through the Whispers exerting his will, not Jenova's, but also through Cloud, the last holder of pure S cells and the person who has the strongest memories and connection to Sephiroth by directly having access to his mind, as demonstrated here by the first time he appears to him one-on-one at the edge of creation. So it's possible that what we thought was a depiction of multiple Sephiroths was basically a peek at the behind the scenes of Sephiroth entering the fray, hijacking the reunion, redirecting it to the northern crater, and as the Omega Ultimania goes on, adding a detour to the Temple of the Ancients to get the black materia, which serves his goal of summoning Meteor, triggering a reaction from the livestream, and being at the center of all of it in order to absorb the planet and, according to him, supposedly save it. And what allowed him to do all of this is breaking Jenova's will and bending it to his interest. From that moment, Sephiroth was reborn into whatever world or continuity this is, and his choice to lead Cloud by toying him does not seem as uncharacteristic anymore, does it? So what about what came next in Rebirth? Did we again see this new Sephiroth trying to change his initial fate, or did we see him go down the exact same path as before? The best way to measure Sephiroth's intentions up to the ending of Rebirth is his actions, and boy does he not apply what he preaches at all. We thought that Ore and Watashi Sephiroths existed separately and had different agendas, but Rebirth, more than Remake, showed that even if that was true at one point, whatever Sephiroth we had at the end of the game was a Jenova puppet more than ever before. But Sephiroth's complexity and the reason he's fooled us all, and will probably fool Cloud in Part 3, is that on the surface his intentions seem to have some honorable dream behind them. And dare I go even further, at first glance Sephiroth's fight seems to be the same as that of the character who probably holds the biggest connection to the planet, the last remaining Cetra, Aerith, which makes sense because Sephiroth, mistakenly thinks he is a Cetra himself. Mind you, she does not fail to recognize that he thinks he wants to save the planet. And she herself claims that the future is always a blank page, pleading to fight even when things don't look bright. But despite that, she knows that this is not the right way of solving the planet's crisis, saying that Sephiroth only cares about the planet and himself. They might share the same goal of purging the planet of the growing threat posed by Jenova, but they dramatically differ in the solution they offer, and the reason they do is because they don't value the same things or view the world the same way to begin with. Aerith's positions are usually very nuanced, while those of Sephiroth are not. She agrees that life and death are two sides of the same coin, and Sephiroth calls death a homecoming, or more accurately, simply returning to the planet. But Aerith also recognizes that despite that, it's still hard to let go of the people we love. Sephiroth's solution to past pain and regrets is what Jenova taught him, turning it all into anger and pursuing a goal that might seem righteous on the surface, but is inevitably just a disguised way of giving in to the despair that she wants to exert on the world. That's why after Aerith and her friends went through trials that incited anger and a sense of revenge, specifically towards Shinra, in a place where she points out that the livestream is angry, Aerith said she understood how those emotions can make people stronger, probably thinking of how she's witnessing it materialize in the flesh in Cloud's journey. But despite that, she still insisted that the cost was too high, and that true strength comes from the ability to forgive and try to make things right rather than give in to the anger. The irony is that both preach for letting go of the past, but when saying so, they mean entirely different things. Angeal told Sephiroth in The First Soldier that his inability to process painful memories opens a backdoor to the spirits. Sephiroth's solution to his past memories is to consider the death of everything a simple homecoming, as long as it satisfied what looks like the last hope of making his own choice, supposedly saving the planet. The existence of the cycle of life and death, according to Aerith, should not undo the quest to preserve life in all its forms, including what makes it even possible in the first place: the memories of people who lived and died on the planet returning to it and giving way for new life. But to Sephiroth, those memories don't matter. The screams of the trapped souls in the livestream actually sound like ecstatic cries to him. Aerith encourages striving for the ideal scenario that preserves the preciousness of life the most even when it seems impossible, while Sephiroth accepts the easy way out, at the very least on paper, regardless of the consequences. And if we were to bring this conflict down to its most fundamental level, Aerith's approach has above all an underlying layer of acceptance of one's past and pain, and processing it before looking forward and aiming for the better. Whereas Sephiroth's biggest driver, and complex as it stands, is his inability to accept. The best example for that is his desire to stay alive and be reborn when almost everything about the planet's crisis just ends if he accepts to finally let go. And mind you, I believe that in the new Final Fantasy VII narrative, Sephiroth's salvation does not only come through accepting his inevitable death, but also possibly through accepting that despite trying his best, he is not the hero who saves the world, and that's okay, because his past shows that he was never given the upbringing and strong sense of self to grow into an actual pure hero. His intentions might still be coming from a good place of wanting to break free, but the way it's all achieved is still wrong. So by trying to become one with the planet and save it, at least in name, he plays exactly into what the Jenova inside of him wants, dreaming of an outcome where he saves the world and failing to realize that it's at the expense of everything that made the world special in the first place. And this might all seem metaphorical, but it's also true technically, because the way he's exerting his will is by trapping spirits in what essentially becomes a stagnant livestream, stopping everyone from returning to the planet and trapping them in a dream, his dream to be precise. A good showcase of this is how some of the trapped spirits who seem to be tragically under the control of Jenova were actually cleansed at the end of Remake, thanks to the actions of the main cast, allowing them to peacefully return to the planet in the form of these white shards, and the formation of this new dream world with very wholly friendly imagery. Yet Sephiroth's will still lives on beyond that through this dream that he wants to enforce now on reality, and that's possibly the biggest driver behind this new narrative centered around the dream worlds, and how they're also bound for the reunion, mirroring the physical Jenova fragments heading towards the northern crater. Just like we have two stories, one for the characters and one for the players, we also have two types of reunion. The classic physical reunion at the northern crater, and the metaphysical one shown through the merging of worlds. In the Temple of the Ancients, Sephiroth says, "My fragmented mother, these errant worlds all shall be one again," to which a more accurate translation of the source Japanese is actually, "With Jenova, the world will also reunite." And as confusing as the mechanics behind these dream worlds are at the moment, would it be surprising that the only way the true Sephiroth is able to interact with the world while still being dead physically is through this dream, with the aim of replacing reality with it? As it stands, he's still unconscious in whatever real physical world there is, and his quest for merging the worlds is essentially in motion through this remake continuity, which almost seems to run as a perfect replica for the real world, with interventions here and there when necessary. This world essentially looks like the metaphysical vessel for Sephiroth's will. And in fact, it already plays out that way at the end of Rebirth, because as soon as Cloud, who Sephiroth now simply lives through, gets his hands on the black materia, the worlds are seemingly merged, before the reunion is stopped by Aerith, thanks to Holy, the white materia. So we spoke before about Sephiroth's characterization evolving dramatically over the past 3 decades, and where this brought us is to a realization that he is a human who keeps trying to break out from the cycle of Jenova manipulation, but inevitably fails every single time, while possessing enough self-awareness to understand what is happening to him. And this, my friends, is when we get to the mysterious new design of Safer Sephiroth, which Nomura confirmed is a different design versus the original, but refused to comment further on. And I have a question. Where has Sephiroth ever looked this tired, depressed, or done with life before this? At the top, a God reborn, and at the bottom, representations of every defining time of his life. A design that depicts his struggles and inevitable descent despite trying to fight against his fate in every single one of these stages. Is this art a foreshadowing of a villain who is so far down what he thinks is a righteous path, but who in a possibly very late moment of reflection over what he was and what he has become, has turned into a complete lost cause? This path that Sephiroth is on, and all the elements the story and its adjacent entries have been putting together, are the perfect setup, not for Sephiroth's redemption, but for his salvation and final return to the planet. Thematically, the FF7 Remake trilogy does not differ with the original story in terms of the headlines, but if there was one specific message that it keeps bringing up, it is that the path forward is through forgiveness and acceptance, rather than anger and refusal to let go. Sephiroth's best visible outcome is not only to finally be afforded the luxury of letting go, but to be forgiven as well, in a recognition of how he is, as much as everyone else, a human soul that hasn't had the love or compassion to stop him from going down the evil path and becoming a victim of the real otherworldly alien threat to the planet. So if we're building up towards a moment of realization, reflection, and finally return to the planet and one's senses, I wonder how the actual main character of the story, Cloud, fits into all of this. And I'll actually make it easier by asking the following. Where have we seen a main character hold the villain and let him go in a moment of implied compassion and, dare I say, forgiveness, realizing that the villain himself was just a victim of circumstances and manipulation, finally freeing him from his curse? In the Advent Children reunion files, and speaking about the story, Nomura says, initially, the church scene was placed immediately after Sephiroth's defeat. None of the sequences with Kadaj were there, such as the scene where Kadaj feels Aerith's presence and disappears into the rain, We wanted to make Kadash someone who also needed salvation. I'm glad that this part made it into the movie. In a world where each of us have constructed both their own version of Final Fantasy VII through the years and what we think this remake should amount to, Sephiroth needing salvation, finally letting go and returning to the planet is hardly an unpopular outcome. And remember when we presented the Sephiroth Dilemma? An outcome accounting for some sort of redemption for him has understandably become more and more popular because it largely satisfies the first constraint. It pays off the new meta-narrative, this increased presence of Sephiroth, and the clear implied link between his backstory and the re-trilogy. Back to the character and player story, the first one pays itself off because it has already been told 29 years ago. But the second one, which seems to speak to us directly, is yet to totally make sense on its own, and wrapping up Sephiroth's arc could make that alternative journey worth it. But despite that, it still doesn't meet the second criteria of our dilemma, which is to not render everything that came after the original Final Fantasy VII useless, particularly Advent Children, and to not create a time travel paradox by avoiding that Sephiroth's trigger to his own salvation in Remake is his non-salvation in the movie. So, can this dilemma ever be solved? Maybe, and maybe not. Maybe the writers can solve it but still decide not to, because they want the story to speak for itself and live on within the player's mind. But regardless of what they decide to do with it, a lack of solutions that satisfy the dilemma is not an issue. And case in point, here is one. Remember how there are literally two Sephiroths, a Jenova projection and his real self? The current path of the story is setting up the latter to have control over things by the end of Part 3, as in the original game. The Ultimania Omega, talking about the OG, says that in time, Sephiroth's will might have taken over Jenova's, and that the one time we meet the real Sephiroth is when we're about to defeat him in the final encounter. So this is not a Jenova projection of him, but rather his human self that has given into the madness, as we just saw. And if Sephiroth was to finally be saved, his salvation would be about the part in him that can return to the planet. The human. The part that did show an ability to reminisce over his past and have a dream, despite how twisted up that dream ended up being. He is, after all, part human, part alien. Which means that a part of him can also never return to the planet, as it never came from it, and will keep coming back, as we see in Advent Children. And the only reason we could ever consider this possible solution is thanks to this mechanism that might have been just an idea in the original game, but was never truly explored until the question mark Sephiroth appeared at the end of Remake in 2020, the hidden initial struggle between Sephiroth and Jenova's will. It is that distinction that could solve the conundrum, allowing us to both have a satisfactory payoff to this remake, while understanding how the events depicted in Advent Children still take place after both FF7 OG and the re-trilogy. With the remake project being tasked with tying into the compilation, referencing existing material rather than retelling the FF7 story as if it existed without acknowledgement of how it has evolved over the years, callbacks and references to future happenings have been at the heart of the re-trilogy. Some of it has been smooth, with an early introduction of characters that we will see in later entries, while some additions have shaken things up, and even led us to wonder if this is a setup for a different ending to the story. By the own admission of the staff working on the project, Remake went as far as recreating the Advent Children battle and bringing a mechanism that summons representations of the three remnants, the main antagonists of the movie, not supposed to have any role at this point in the story. And all of it confused the hell out of us. But maybe it did because we never thought about it the right way. We spoke about the trilogy recontextualizing Advent Children, and this is what that means. Final Fantasy VII, and especially Final Fantasy VII Remake, are a story about the main character letting go of his anger. But in that journey, the character's emotions and past are not all fully processed yet, As sane as Cloud looked at the end of the original game, he still had grief to go through in the couple of years following that. In fact, supposedly fully healed Cloud still had remote Jenova visions by himself, reminded him of his painful past as late as the beginning of the Advent Children story. Cloud isolates himself because he's afraid that bad things will happen again to those around him, just like it did for those before. And if we've come to learn anything about Jenova, is that she pounces on guilt, which is why, if FF7 was about letting go of anger, Advent Children is about letting go of guilt. Jenova's power to shape-shift, change the landscape, and keep coming back is largely rooted in its ability to peer into people's souls, their fears, and their memories, and manifest them in an instrumentalized way, something we've seen happen to Sephiroth himself in the past. So the rhetorical question becomes, does Remake reference Advent Children memories, or is it the other way around? Could Jenova eventually manifest the memories of Cloud and others from Remake in Advent Children, recreating the expressway Sephiroth fight in its latest attempt to be reborn into the planet? Does the true Sephiroth refuse to become a memory after Advent Children, leading to his return in Remake, a Sephiroth who struggles to remember who he is, who unlike his OG self is obsessed with Cloud, and who shares the exact same mission as Jenova, sailing the cosmos with this planet as his vessel? Or is it all the doing of Jenova itself, lingering in the livestream, clinging to people's memories, and desperately looking for the strongest possible connection in the physical world to manifest Sephiroth and bring him back? Is this him or the memory of him persisting in the livestream and people's minds? Does Advent Children set up the events in Remake, or have the writers achieved the impossible task of remaking a prequel while smoothly setting up events and concepts for its unchanged sequel? In fact, Sephiroth's return in Advent Children is so confusing that the writers themselves, while recognizing the importance of bringing him back in the movie one way or the other, still struggled to come up with a valid reason for him to appear 2 years after seemingly being defeated. Going back to the Advent Children reunion files, Nojima says, "During the initial development phase, we didn't really have a very specific reason as to why Sephiroth would come back to see Cloud. I mean, we had a vague reason, but it wasn't very clearly laid out. Various ideas were put on the table, such as having Cloud be the only one who can see Sephiroth. The concept of the power of memories in the livestream has always been there from 1997, but since then, it has become front and center to almost every new entry in the compilation, and both Remake and Advent Children are no different. So the necessary question is the following: is the story cleverly using this concept of memories, which fortunately or unfortunately for us, can be referenced interchangeably in both past and future, to simulate the world one last time in the livestream, completely detached from any physical existence in what is essentially a secret FF7 sequel? Or is it instead using the same concept and power of memories to make sure that the transition between the story and its actual movie sequel finally makes sense? A transition that was never intended in the first place, but that became necessary when deciding to remake an entry that had countless spin-offs to it. And at the center of those memories are those of the main character of Final Fantasy VII, not Sephiroth. This guy. This is Cloud's story, and the core driver behind his iconic journey is the contrast versus the villain, despite their relatively similar journeys, and his ability to succeed where Sephiroth was never able to, and break free from the fake destiny being enforced on him. As someone who goes on and on and on about Cloud all day, I tried my best to avoid focusing on him while thinking about this topic, but inevitably, the narrative beats of core FF7 have always served the purpose of portraying his story. We already have games where Zack and Sephiroth are the main characters, and it's not FF7 Remake. Cloud's journey is special not because he and others end up helping Sephiroth land the killing blow to Jenova and walk into the sunset, but because he grows to do so himself, despite not being set up to be the perfect hero, and in spite of the strongest soldier that has ever lived, now being reborn as a god. But hey, all of the above would only make sense if this distinction between Sephiroth and Jenova's will is valid to begin with, not only in the context of the original game and remake as we saw, but more importantly in the context of the actual sequel, Advent Children. If only we had a way to verify this claim. Remember what I told you about something not being totally incorrect, but rather a half-truth? I'm sorry for having to do this, but I was guilty of it this time. Back to Nojima's quote, during the initial development phase, we didn't really have a very specific reason as to why Sephiroth would come back to see Cloud. I mean, we had a vague reason, but it wasn't very clearly laid out. Various ideas were put on the table, such as having Cloud be the only one who can see Sephiroth. But towards the end, they solidified into the idea that it was actually Jenova's will, not Sephiroth's. Whichever way this story goes, let's enjoy the ride, because once we roll the credits on part 3, it's all over, and we will not get to live through this era of mad speculation ever again. So let's make it pleasant for all of us, let's be great to each other, and hear what the game preaches. Compassion, acceptance, and trying to do the right thing. Because even if each of us has their own version of Final Fantasy VII in their mind, we all share the same passion for this story. And the things that unite us in this remake journey are much bigger than the ones that divide us. If you've been here from the very first video, I can't thank you enough for the love you showed, giving me the inspiration to keep doing this. And if you've just come across this channel for the first time, welcome on board, and I hope you enjoyed this. Take care.